Well, hey, welcome back to another episode of the Frozen Assets podcast series. This specific series on the Freeze Dry Business Channel is focused on entrepreneurs in freeze drying. And what we're trying to do is focus on people who are either innovating products and equipment in freeze drying, also entrepreneurs as well. And we're fortunate to be able to have someone who's actually not even from the US where I'm based. This is a freeze dryer company that's been around since the 1960s. Who we're talking to today is Blair Kibblewhite, and he's from Cuddon Freeze Dry. They're based in New Zealand, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about his company, but also just his information and knowledge about the freeze drying space since he's been in it for over a decade, and kind of better understand what's been happening in the world of freeze drying and get his take on what he thinks the future holds for that. So Blair, thanks for coming on board and chatting with us on the podcast and this freeze drying channel. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do for Cuddon and then the company as well.
Sure. Thanks a lot, David, for the invitation. Cuddon's been around as an engineering company for, I think we're pushing on 85 years. And it's a family-owned company. So the Cuddon is third generation at the moment with some shareholders, but it's mainly owned by Robin and John Cuddon, who although they're in their 80s, they're actually still on the board of directors. Way back in 1963, I think it was, 55 years ago, the Cuddon that was there at the moment, WGG Cuddon, he actually saw some freeze drying technology over in the US and came back and said, we're going to be building freeze dryers. So no idea whatsoever what it was going to be. But the engineering side out of it was something that they were good at. They were very innovative. They were innovative. On how they got around looking at things and going, right, how do we back engineer this, make this work? And it's part of the Kiwi mentality. We call it number 8 wire mentality. Something go, how do we make that work? And go from there. So they built a couple of freeze dryers, went to the local veggie place down the road that was making pea, or they were harvesting peas, and said, right, you need to be freeze drying these. And so they said, yep, sure, okay. And that's how it evolved. So it was quite a simplistic way of doing it, but ironically, the chamber design has not actually changed since we built things. What we see today is very much the same as what it has been. And this is where we differ a little bit from other companies out there. We are what we call a batch drying, conducted batch drying process. So this is where the trays actually sit directly on top of the plates. And so you see that with the electric shelving systems, they do that. But then there's the other type, which is actually suspended between that, and that's the radiant style freeze drying. So, and there's pros and cons for different sorts, but we've stuck with this process, and it's worked very well. To the point that the dryers now can actually go straight into a dairy factory, and they're compliant, FDA compliant. For dairy side of things. So it's a good style. Not many of us out there doing this sort of style of freeze drying, design freeze drying. And it just works for us.
Yeah. Now, you said like 1963. So like what in the heck was being freeze dried in the 60s, 70s, 80s? Because I'm completely new to this industry. As of, when I started my freeze drying business in 2020, but what were they freeze drying back then? Because a lot of us don't really know what freeze drying was prior to having a home freeze dryer.
Originally it was foods. So the classic was the peas. We had here in New Zealand a thing called surprise peas, and they were shriveled up little green peas that when you put them into water, they then expanded up because they were rehydrating themselves. Thank goodness they've got rid of those because they were pretty awful. But now with the sort of the technology and the innovation of what's going through with products on how to freeze products better to retain all its nutrients and all of those sort of things, the freeze drying process has become a little bit easier. So it was really foods, cereal type foods, so strawberries and those sort of things in there, but it wasn't a great deal of it. Come into the early 80s, floral drying took off, and we built 100 odd floral dryers. And the difference between the floral dryer and the current drying that you see now is that the ice core was separate. So it was sitting down the bottom, and you had the chamber up the top, which had the product in it. Now, there are still pharmaceutical type dryers on the market that have that there. In the commercial range, not so much, mainly because you had the small chamber that held the ice. You couldn't get enough ice on it for what you could put into the chamber itself, the product chamber itself. But floral drying need to be done need to be done over sort of 10 days sort of style. And it's because the cell structure of a petal is very, very delicate. And when the sublimation process happens, when you apply heat, the more heat you apply, the faster that ice crystal will come out. So if you slow that heat down, so if you have a lower heat, you don't have as fast. It's like putting your foot on the throttle. If you did it too fast, the ice crystals, they'd rip through the cell structure. When you would then break the vacuum, they would actually collapse because the cell structure of the actual petal was impeded and had nothing to hold itself together. So that was done very slowly, but it was done with this separate ice core, so you could actually defrost but not break the vacuum in the chamber. So yeah, a lot of those happened. And I think the 80s, a lot more of that was around the floral drying. There was more on the dairy side of things. The general public didn't really know what it was, so nothing really eventuated out of that until we started to get into the 90s where, the fruits and vegetables and all of that started to kick off a lot more. And then other people started saying, well, if they can freeze dry, let's just build one. And there's been other people on the podcast that you've done. You can build a freeze dryer, but it's difficult. Anyone can do it, but getting it right is actually can be a real challenge. So the likes of the smaller units like the Harvest Rights, all of those coming out, has actually really helped promote the freeze drying in there. And while all that's happening, in the other side of things, the nutraceutical and the pharmaceutical have been doing it for a long time, but people have turned around and said, well, if you're only removing the moisture, what's left is actually the nutrients. So what can we do with that nutrients? And this is where the things like powders, so take a product and seaweed, for instance, aquaculture, they find that there's a lot of good nutrients inside of that. And if you can remove that moisture and just have that product sitting there, and you've got no heat to turn around and bioactivities and all of that, you've got a really good dry powdering. So that then can be put into other ingredients, made into encapsulated, stuff for good health and those sort of things. So yeah, a lot of that started to bubble on the other side and grew.
There's so many applications to freeze drying that I'm uncovering as I've had this podcast and this channel. You mentioned a lot of different things with powders and putting them in, encapsulating them into supplements. That's very high density of those nutrients. That's very high. I wanted to go back to the part about the floral. It's one of the things that I looked at actually getting into right when I kind of bought my first Harvest Right freeze dryer. I was like, freeze drying wedding bouquets and things like that seemed right. But I always wondered, and maybe you can answer this, with potpourri. I remember back in the 90s, my mom always had dried flowers and dried sticks and stuff like that, just potpourri mixtures. Was that freeze dried or is that dehydrated? And how are people using what's a freeze dried flower used for other than preserving?
Yeah. So the potpourri is actually I'm not 100% sure, but it's another drying medium, and I think it might just be drying of thyme. versus putting it through a heat process. It may have done that way, but it's not done freeze-dried. So paper is not a freeze-dried product. People are doing petals so that they can have those as garnishes, as something they can throw weddings, as those sort of things, but also for eating as well. So there are some flower petals that you can eat. So you freeze dry those and then you can put those on top of foods. The wedding bouquet is still there. People still like to have their bouquet in there. And so that's starting to have a resurgence. What killed out in the late 90s, the floral drying was the plastic flower. They were making it so good that people say, and it's all cheap. So it almost died overnight. But now people are starting to come back and go, well, actually, I've really got the stuff. What can I do to preserve it? So that's where that sort of style is coming back. And there are still people out there saying, I want to do rose petals, rose heads, and all of that. And there's a different way of doing things. So when you're talking about petals, you can put them onto a tray, and that's fine. So that the distance between your heat plates, you're not impeded by how much you're putting in there, so to speak. Whereas you're doing a rose head or a flower head, it's got to sit upright. So you can't do it in your standard tray, because as soon as you light flat, if that side gets flattened, when it's dried, it will be flat. So you need to be able to stand them. So in our dryers, we've had a wire mesh system, and they would just poke down through it. And then you were doing that at cost of not having a lot of heating in there. So in your standard freeze dryer, each plate that you're putting your tray onto is a heated tray. Whereas when you're doing that in the floral dryer, that mesh tray had no heating on it. So it was really a lot of radiant heat, and that hence why it was quite slow as well. There wasn't a lot of energy input into that chamber. So yeah, different ways of doing them.
Now, you've been in the industry for quite a while. So with that, you've seen a lot of different clients all over the world doing different things. What would you say are like the top applications for freeze drying from, let's say, 10 years ago when you kind of started it, kind of being with Cuddon? But then tell me also about like now, what are you seeing as of the past couple of years? So start with, what were people freeze drying before, and then now what are they doing?
Back in the day, dairy was a really big thing. So this is the dairy companies, a lot of they call it whey protein extracts, WPCs and all of those sort of things. Lactoferrin was the biggie one, and that was very good for infant formula because it was something that the babies would use very well. So that had a big surge then. They were selling almost $3,500 USD a kilo dried. So it would go. It would take, and I think these figures are not quite accurate, 6 million litres to get a 100,000 litres of protein extract or lactoferrin out. So the process that they had to go through was taking the milk and then actually going through ion columns exchanges and pulling it out. And so it was a multi-million-dollar setup from the start just to be able to get this product out the end. So that was the real big thing. Food was still in there. So your fruits, classic's always going to be strawberries, but it's things like they were doing stuff for the cereals and all of that. And then as that grew, pet food started to come on as well. So that came in 3 or 4 years later. We started to see a surge in pet food, and we got involved with the Pet Food Forum in the States. They had a conference each year, and that's growing. And that's still actually a big growth in the pet food industry, although it's only 12%, 15% of full pet food, dry kibble, baked, frozen, all of that. The freeze dried is still increasing. had a bit of a little plateau recently. I mean, everything since the COVID time has gone up and down, and it's still finding its way. And then we had aquaculture coming through. So that's the seaweed side of things. And recently, around 2019, 2020, we were heavily involved with working with one particular company with the Asparagopsis. And so we've done a lot of trials, and I've done a lot of work with Asparagopsis myself personally. And
what is that?
It's a seaweed that gives off a bromoform. Now, bromoform is what reduces the methane in cows. So when they birth, it is all part of this greenhouse gas reduction around the world. So, of course, here in New Zealand and Australia, we have a lot of dairy cattle. So it's one way of reducing that methane into the atmosphere. And so that is still working through at the moment. They're still working around what's the best drying method, because I think they might have found some other ones in freeze dry. We know it works with freeze dry, but the product itself, the more you handle it, the more it releases the bromoform, the more it denatures what you're trying to keep. So it's about what do you do beforehand to what you're getting at the end. So one of the biggest things that I say to people who are looking at starting with something that is a little bit different, the product's a little bit different. So then take the product and test it, cut it, slice it, dice it, whatever you're going to do. You want to freeze dry it, test it, freeze it, test it, freeze dry it, test it, and then whatever else you're going to do, if you're going to do a milling process or anything like that for a powder, then test it. So all of those tests, work out if there's any degradation over that product and whereabouts it is, because then you can start saying, well, okay, the handling of that product at the beginning is degrading the product. I'm not getting the nutrients that I want to keep. So you've got to look at something else doing. The milling process is doing it. So do I need to check that? So there's a lot of processes that you need to look at, and freeze drying is only 1/3 out of the total process. You could do something beforehand, you could do something afterwards.
Yeah.
So
one thing that I did in a video recently was freeze drying my mother's homemade guacamole recipe, because when avocados are in season, you can get a great deal, but when they're out of season, they're very expensive. And so if you made a huge batch of fresh guacamole, but you reconstituted it with the water back in, you can make and freeze dry, a certain amount of, milligrams or ounces of actual like fresh organic guacamole that has a lot of different ingredients in it. And I reconstituted it back, and it tasted the exact same. And so it's kind of one of those things where you have to figure out in your business, how are, like you said, testing and tasting and doing these sort of things. But what do you want the product to be as a standalone product? Do you want it to be a snack as a freeze-dried product? Do you want it to be reconstituted? Do you want it to be applied as a powder so it's used as an ingredient? And all those different things kind of depend on what you're going to use an actual freeze-dryer machine for as well. I wanted to ask you, Blair, since we're still on the topic of just applications, what's kind of the most unique application you've seen? You said I think that's a seaweed application. Is very, very unique. But what are you seeing that's a company's actually made a business out of?
I said to this company that I said I'll just do some trials because their machine wasn't giving them the results I want. So I said, send me someone, I'll test it for you. It was bovine urine, and I tell you what, it's not pleasant at all. But this is a company that does a lot of testing for dairy farms up in the North Island of New Zealand, and so that they can make sure that the dairy cattle are getting the right nutrients that they need. Then they can, if they're not, then they can adjust feed and grass and all the other bits that they do. One of the tests is the urine from the cows. So I've done everything from larvae to pickets to breast milk to machine parts. Actually, a guy was renovating or restoring back, I think it was an old motorbike, and he had, I think it might have been something to do with the generator type thing in the motorbike engine or whatever it was, but we put that through the dryer just to remove any residual moisture that may have built up over time. And that's done that. Disaster recovery, and that's another area that we do. We've built disaster recovery freeze dryers. Shipwreck timbers, got a client over in where are they? Melbourne, who've just finished doing something that they pulled out of the Sydney Harbour.
Interesting. I was curious of like, what are the non-food item applications out there that people currently have businesses for, because it opens up people's brainstorming ideas of what's possible with freeze drying waterlogged materials. I can see that.
Yeah, and there's a couple of clients that we've got over in Baltimore who've got our freeze dryers for doing the disaster recovery, and it's one of those things. They don't get used all the time, but when a disaster does happen, if you get floods and all of that, then they're inundated, and they've got years worth of work, of going through there. If people want to go and really see something that's quite cool, it was Kansas City, Missouri. They've got the steamboat restoration project going down there, and I visited that, and they freeze dried that pulled out of the Mississippi. So steamboats got submerged, logs sunk, the river then changed, and the whole boat being got encased with the mud, and they've turned around, found where these boats actually are floating boats, and they were just pulling things out one by one, and there's just boxes and cases of trading, so shoes, there's plates, whatever it is, but there's a lot of material stuff in clothing and all of that, and they're just slowly working their way through and freeze drying those and bringing them back, and then they've got them on show to be able to see what's coming out of it, and it's pristine, absolutely pristine, because the mud's preserved it.
But my question would be, if it's removing the moisture, would it make that material become very delicate and fragile to take apart the mud so that you can actually then have it as an artifact?
Some do, some don't. So I think it depends on how that artifact's being preserved. So if you take a shipwreck timber, for instance, a lot of them are actually bringing that out and encasing that into PEG solution, which is polyethylene glycol solution. And what that does is that when it freeze dries, that polyethylene glycol that falls into where the ice crystals were, and that keeps the rigidity of the product. So otherwise, if you didn't do that, it would actually just disintegrate, just fall away. Whereas I think these other products were so well preserved, because although they were in the water, they've actually preserved by the mud. They've actually not affected by it. So, they treat everything with thick gloves until they know that it's going to be stable to be able to be shown. So they've got, tons of it. And, well worth going to have a look. It's just mind-blowing.
That's great. Yeah, I'd love to get over there. Blair, with our time too, I'd like to talk a little bit about your machines as well, and just kind of better understand, how large your machines are. People who are not even familiar with what your machines are capable of doing. Could you just kind of profile what your machines are and how they are unique, as well as your CO2 refrigerant? I know that that's a big part of your design engineering and what kind of sets you apart. So talk a little bit about Cuddon Freeze Dryers.
Yeah. So we've had a range now that we've reduced it down to about 4. So, and I've converted this into pounds so people can understand. So, but we've got 4 in the range. So FD 100, FD 600, FD 1200, and FD 1800. Now, those numbers denote the ice traps capacity, and they are in kilograms. So when we convert that over, it's 220 pound, 1323 pound, 2645 pound, and just under 4,000 pound for the large 1800. So
Wow.
what that means is if you put product in there, so long as you do not see the ice trap's capacity, you can put you can put up to that amount in there. So if you put in, 100 one, a product 20% moisture, 20% solids, you could put in more than 100 kilograms, of product in there. But the physical side comes into it. Can you physically fit more into a tray in that sense? Because you're cutting, you're slicing, you're dicing. Some of these are big products. It's bulk density. If the product is a puree or liquid sort of thing, you obviously can fill it those quite well into there. So we say to people, start with that number of as your input number. And then after you've done a couple of runs, the product's looking what you want it to be, it's testing that it's got all the nutrients and all the other things that go with it, then we can start looking at optimization. And that's the next sort of step that we work through with people. But all of these products we sell are on a turnkey basis. So we work with the client at the beginning, walk them through that journey of freeze drying, because some people come to us and go, we don't know what we want. We don't know anything. Help us. So we talk through that, work out what their product's doing, and testing if we have to, where we can help them on that, to the point where they're saying, yes, we're now allowed to proceed. Build that machine to the specs that we've worked out, and then we will manage that delivery all the way to their door, and then we will do the installation, do the commissioning, and then we do the training, and then I kick in after that to say, okay, let's look at the runs that you're doing, and let's look at your recipe. We give them a couple of basic recipes, and then we just try and point that so it's running, but also educate them so that at the end, they know what that machine's doing, what that graph's showing them, and what they can change to do it. Now, at any stage, they can come back and just say, hey, here's this product. This is what it looks like. Here's the recipe graph. This is what this looks like. This is what we're trying to achieve. What's your thoughts? And that can be a few years down the track if they want to, but it's always there. We're always supporting our clients, for the duration that they've got it from there. And when we do that installation side of things, we're using local contractors. So a lot of the bigger clients will have a refrigeration company, a Sparky, somebody can do welding, those sort of things. So we all talk to those guys first and say, here's the project. This is what we want you to do. We'll pay for you time to do it. You're working for us, but in the end, we're going to teach you how that, especially on the refrigeration side, we'll teach you how that's working so that you become the local support network for your client. And we keep that in there. And there's sort of a triangular thing there where the client can talk back to their refrigeration guy if they need to, but they can also talk back to us as well. So it depends on how much we need to do.
And how do you support all this process, though, from New Zealand? So do you have representation in the U.S. For Canadian, people who are watching this, South America, Europe? Like, how do you support the amount of clients that could use a Cuddon freeze dryer?
So a lot of that comes back to the local support as their first port of call, but we're always at the end of the phone, the video call, text and email or anything like that. And, if it means that we work outside of our hours to be in their hours because we need to resolve an issue of some sort, so be it. That's what it is. And that's the downside out of being remote. We do have a remote connection, so we can look at a dryer while it's in its dry mode, and we can analyze that and then talk to them. If we get access to full-blown access, we can then turn around and do some tweaks if we have to. It depends on the level they want us to be involved with. But as I say, 60 odd years of doing freeze drying, we've always done it this way, and it's worked very well so far. The basis out of those empowering, educating that client so that they're not reliant on us. When we build a machine, we use very well-known branded product parts and plants that they can then go down to the hardware store or the electrical store down the road, and they can then turn around and go, right, this is the relay that I need to replace. And it's a common relay that they can replace from their local plant. They don't need to come to us for that. And we do that on purpose, yeah. So it just means that they've got full control over their machines to the point that they can run that and not talk to us if they don't, you know. So
one thing I've appreciated about other commercial freeze dryer companies and yourself from just our conversation here is that it seems like the commercial industrial freeze dryer companies, you're very consultative in your sales approach, versus the countertop, home freeze dryers. It's something you can buy online very easily. It's very transactional, and that type of thing, which is fine for the average person. But for someone who is trying to create a sustainable, very like high growth type company where you're employing people, you're refining the operations, you want something that's more low pressure and is understanding what the recipe is and taking all that full service. So yeah, it definitely seems like that's your approach.
Yeah. And you'll find that any good freeze drying manufacturer will take the same approach, because in the end, it's a journey the client wants to go on. It's not an easy one. Someone said freeze drying is not like rocket science; it's harder. And I think you'll testify to that. There are so many things that don't go right, and you kind of you're scratching your head and think, why did it not go the same way as it did last time? And the variables are huge. So you've got to make sure that the client understands that when something is not correct, what to try and look for, try and do. And it could be fruit. It could be the variety, where it's from, the seasons in there, how long it's been in a freezer for. All of those have an input out of how it dries. And, we've got a client who is very, very particular on sort of fruit he gets, and he brings it in from overseas. And to the point that some of his containers, he said, I don't want those. They are not going to work for what I want. So, yeah, it's not a widget. When you're talking at this level here, we're not talking about a widget. And no disrespect to the smaller home style freeze dryers, but they've tried to make it as easy and simple as possible. But when you get to that commercial level where you've got to have something that is the same every single time, 365 days a year, you've got to have some sort of engineering understanding and the process understanding and all of that. You've got to learn that. Hey, we're here to teach, and make sure that they do. We learn off our clients and they learn off us. So it's a two-way street.
Yeah. And where, in terms of the kind of your global representation, like where are you seeing the most growth globally within the freeze drying side of things?
The US is ahead in some areas, very a lot more than others. So pet food's a classic. It has had more growth in that area than the EU or the UK. They're starting to now come on stream. We're seeing some good inquiries coming out of there. In the fruit side of things, and strawberries is always a place because everyone wants to do strawberries. And I tell you what, there's so many people doing strawberries, it's not funny. And if you don't have a large machine that can tune it out quickly, you're way behind. But the likes of the Baltic area, Poland, those areas of the EU are huge, very, very huge. Turkey and Hungary, they're coming on stream as well. There's been a lot of inquiries coming from there. And there's always stuff that comes out of the States for food processing and those sort of things. And then you get into the agriculture side of things, and they're Asia, Oceania. Australia and all of that, mainly because it's where it's growing at the moment, and there's a lot of university input out of those areas to sort of stem this. What can we do with the seaweed and all of that? And it's not just the asparagus; it's other sorts of seaweed as well. Then you have the people who are looking at that, so the plant-based foods that they're trying to achieve. So they're looking at other nutrients they can put. They're pulling from all different. The other big one that's coming through that's still there, and no one quite knows how to do it properly, but it's the waste stream market. Everyone turns around and knows that there is a problem. Everyone knows that if you freeze dry the waste stream, the ugly fruits and all of those sort of things that you have, you've some really good stuff, but no one's really fact that this is what we're going to be selling. Everyone says this is what can be done. Yes, that can be done, but the market's not going to want to pay for it because, if you look at the classic is, I do it in kilos. 1 kilo of dried product is 9 kilos of raw product going in. So your price has gone up 9 times, and that's for instance. So the price goes up. So the market's got to be able to sustain that value out of that. But the more that they can do with waste stream and get that there into another sort of product, the better it is.
It's a lot of the different applications that you have to think that there's food waste rate, which is what you're talking about, which is outrageous in the United States. It's like close to 40%. So if for someone to think about how do I help society, like what's our civic duty, or what do we feel compelled with humanitarianly to help with the poor and the people who with starvation, like how can we use freeze drying with the waste that it currently has in a very rich country? How can we use that to the betterment of third world countries? And I think the other side of it is, powderize something that is freeze dried so that it can be smaller, but still with a high density of nutrients. And then with the regular existing freeze dried product, it's like, how can we, keep product longer so that as population grows in the world and the US and things like that, like for the average person, how can you just keep your grocery and all those different things, the cost down, but still keep your nutrients so you don't have to buy all the crappy foods, things like that.
That's right. And one thing that I found in the UK was that their filled, frozen and fresh, but mainly fresh, is still very, very high. So people don't look at freeze drying as much because they can get really good product, really cheap. So they don't worry about this freeze drying. So whereas the US is quite different in its approach. So each country is going through its own different evolution. And that's why some are a little bit slower than others from there. But in the end, we'll migrate through because they'll see the advantages. But there are some things like in the dairy side where freeze drying is the best way of doing it. Now you can freeze dry some, whey protein extracts, but they denature. So it depends on what level do I want the very best to. I would like something that's not quite the best, because that then has an influence on the market. The market might say, hey, down lower is fine for us. Let's turn around and start buying all that up. And that means the freeze drying side starts to fall away because the demand goes. So,
Blair, where do you see freeze drying headed? If you could give an outlook for what y'all are preparing for with your company and with everything that you see across the world and even in the US, what's your outlook for the freeze drying industry? If you were going to give us kind of your take on what's going to be happening.
Oh God, I wish I had that crystal ball. I'd be entirely those companies straight away. Food is always going to be in there. The pet food doesn't look like it's going to stop out of there. It's the next emerging market we don't know Now I've seen snippets of ones and kidneys of cannabis is a classic, and that's growing. I mean, it's, I suppose, what else can they do with that cannabis product? I mean, there's the bud and all of that, but what else can they do that makes it better to sell? Have we seen what they're doing now is the end, and different sorts of outcomes with that product? Is that what they're going to do, or is it going to be better? I don't know. So there's those sort of things, and then is there any other foods there that will take off? And it's really hard because they've been around for such a long time. How many ways can you sell an apple? You can cut it, slice it, dice it, pulverize it, whatever. But how many more can you do? What else can you do with that to make it different, that it has another market to it? So I don't want to say that they're limited, but they're definitely going to be challenged. The ready-made meals, I think, are still there and growth. And I know the likes of the Mountain have been around for ages. And we've got a couple of big for New Zealand, but not big in comparison to what you guys have got. Ready-made meals out there that are freeze dry. Can people do it better than that? Who knows? So there is these different ingredients that people try and do. So I don't know how well the plant-based side of things is going. There's signs that it's slowed right down and that people are not accepting it as much as they used to. Don't know. So it's those sort of, and I don't want to call them a fad, but those sort of things that come in, people go, yeah, this is really, really cool. And then they sort of disappear out. Are they going to re-emerge somewhere else? Yeah, it's a crystal ball that no one can look at.
Yeah. I'm doing some investigation on, what is considered a fad. And, usually it's something that, it is capitalized by a lot of people all at the same time. And then what ends up happening is you have a lot of consolidation, and then one or two companies comes out of it, and they become kind of the brand that everyone knows about. And then you have a lot of modifiers of those. And I think that's what's going to be happening with the candy side of freeze drying is a lot of excitement came out of candy. You now know that a freeze dryer, or at least, a vacuum plus heat can really pop the sugar molecules of certain candies. So that's really fun. But now it's like, okay, there's currently a lot of candy makers, or there's only a certain amount of candy maker companies, Mars Wrigley, Hershey, a lot of these Nestle, things like that. And so they have the market for developing candy, but who's going to be someone who develops a new type of freeze-dried candy that isn't the brand name of those companies? Yeah. And I think that's where that type of market will go, and there'll be some consolidation. But I think what comes usually out of that type of fad is a completely new market as well. And so I think that that's where the freeze-drying space is headed. And it's clear from the freeze-dried pet food pet food's been around for a long time, but you're still saying that it's still growing. And I think that's because basically companies are finding new ways to add new SKU numbers. They're creating a new product. Also, raw, organic, not antibiotics, but non-pesticide types of foods is what people are desiring today because of our health. And so I think that's really going to move things in the next way.
I mean, some of these pet food manufacturers, their plants are basically human-grade facilities. As I said, it's just as easy to do that. And then the owner of the pets know that they're getting extremely good product from there, which is good for their animals. And people are spending a lot of money on their animals, fur babies, they call them. So I don't think that trend is not going to stop. There's going to be a lot more. and especially when you start looking at, I think over an age, they just have so many pets, obviously more than they do have children, which is not good for their demographics, of course. But that stems a huge market, and it's everyone's sort of. I mean, I talk to guys here in our pet food industry, and they're just saying, yeah, the Asian market is doing really, really well for us. So
Yeah.
may it last, ride that wave.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always kind of wondered, I'm a big fan of sushi and things like that. That's all raw fish, but usually has to be imported. A lot of people want the freshest type of product, but it's like, well, if something could be freeze dried in the sushi, Japanese type of market, and you're freeze drying all of that seafood, and then you just have a way to reconstitute it easily, it's the same product, but you're putting it into a cuisine that most people recognize.
Yeah.
So
I did try sushi, actually, freeze drying sushi. It dried really well, but it didn't reconstitute very well.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't try very hard on the reconstitute. I just put it into water and whatever from there. But it was like a rice cracker at the end of it. So light as anything. All the mushi came out really well. So it's not been for anyone out there who wants to turn around and do that. That's a market that's not been tapped yet.
Yeah. And I'm not even thinking of the actual roll. I'm thinking like, how can you freeze dry one piece of something that usually has to be, the seafood product has to be used in a certain finite time. So it's like, how can you freeze dry that piece of eel, and that eel can be reconstituted the way you want it to? I'm sure a lot of sushi owners of restaurants would love to encapsulate that. Yeah. So, Blair, thanks so much for your time on this podcast and telling us about Cuddon and just your experience and knowledge. I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot more. Could you just kind of fill us in on where do we find out more about the company, and who do we kind of reach out to if we're in the U.S. and Canada?
So our website, it's cuddonfreezedry.com, and we've got a inquiry page there. But we've got a guy in Milwaukee, Lloyd Parks, and he's been around in pet food and human consumption food on the meat side of things for decades, and was operator for one of the larger pet food companies in freeze drying in the States there. So he is a wealth of knowledge, and anything that comes through that goes into the States will go through to him. And then we also have Link Burgess, who's based here in New Zealand, but he supports supports Lloyd, and so they're going to be at trade shows. I go across to trade shows as well on the bigger ones. So we are there. We put onto our website whereabouts the next shows are, where we're going. So Lloyd, right at the moment, it's at NJ BizCon, and then IPP in January, Pet Food Forum. So yeah, it's
awesome.
It's all go. So yeah, we do a lot of trade shows around the States, and easy enough to drop us a line, have to talk, set up a call or anything like that. Even if it's just that sort of initial, what do I need to know? And it costs nothing to be able to do that, but at least you get some idea, because in the end, you've got to make a business decision on what to do as a process. And freeze drying is that process. You need to know the information about that.
Well, thanks, Blair, for your time. Appreciate it. And we'll be chatting with you later on to find out more about Cuddon.
Yeah, no problem. Nice chatting with you, Dave. Cheers.
Thank you.